In 2022, Sri Lanka was making headlines for all the wrong reasons. Shrinking exports coupled with climbing debt from foreign loans led to a massive financial and political crisis. What once seemed to be a dream success story, a rural economy on its way to modern industrialisation, turned into a nightmare, and it was clear that the country faced an uphill battle. But Sri Lanka's recovery, at a quick glance, seems to be going quite well. Their currency has gotten stronger, their GDP is inching back, and the government was able to achieve a small primary budget surplus, which is crucial to actually paying off their debt instead of simply managing it. On top of that, they've secured a bailout with International Monetary Fund to help them with their outstanding debts, and they've managed to negotiate with foreign investors to make paying their debts more feasible. So while Sri Lanka isn't on course for a success story anymore, maybe they could pull off a comeback story instead. Sri Lanka's citizens must be feeling optimistic, right? Well, no. Sri Lankans are getting poorer, living in worse conditions, or leaving altogether. As the economy gets back on its feet, the people living in Sri Lanka are struggling to feel the positive effects that you might expect. It's an interesting phenomenon and one that might not make a lot of sense on the surface. How does the country get better while the people are worse off? How can recovery mean the very opposite for the population? Given the divergence between the government and its people, it's worth looking at Sri Lanka as a case study to understand the negative effects of its economic recovery, as well as how future countries should approach economic crises. So, how did Sri Lanka pull off its recovery so far? Why has its recovery been so bad for its people? And finally, are these negative consequences of such a turnaround unavoidable? Did you know that your personal data is likely being bought and sold online as we speak? Names, emails, addresses, even sensitive login information is all out there circulating amongst data brokers without your permission. This isn't just a minor inconvenience, it opens the door to spam, scams, and even identity theft. Fortunately, there's a way to take control of your digital privacy thanks to Ngumi, today's sponsor. Ngumi is like a personal data cleaning service. You simply authorise them to act on your behalf and they'll track down and remove your information from countless databases. When I signed up, Ngumi uncovered 89 places where my data was being sold. Within an hour, they had already started removing it from 26 of them and they were still at work. The best part? You don't need to lift a finger. Ngumi handles it all, helping you reduce your risk of spam, scams, and worse. Take control of your privacy today, click the link in the description and use our code ECONOMICS for 60% off an annual plan with Ngumi. The crux of Sri Lanka's financial recovery is nothing we haven't seen before. One of the last resorts of countries in economic dire straits is the International Monetary Fund. Based in Washington, the IMF is a financial agency of the United Nations, considered to be the world's lender of last resort. When a country doesn't have the funds to pay for essential imports or pay off external debts, that's what's called a balance of payments crisis. In that case, the IMF can use funds provided by its 190 member countries to inject short-term capital and sort out the balance of payments. And like many other countries throughout recent history, that's exactly what Sri Lanka did after 2022, negotiating for a support package equaling $2.9 billion. This money doesn't come without a catch though. While the IMF does exist to assist countries in crisis, they also work to reduce the actual number of crises. Especially as an international body, the last thing they want is the moral hazard of a government thinking they can be reckless with their spending and fall back on the IMF if things go awry. To make sure countries will avoid recurring balance of payments issues going forward, IMF negotiations require the negotiating country to commit to economic reforms intended to maintain stability once it's achieved. The IMF's program for Sri Lanka focused on the nation's massive budget deficit, targeting them through pretty severe austerity measures. This is simply a reduction in expenditures and/or an increase in taxes, all in accordance with the basic principle of any emergency budget. If you're in unsustainable debt, you shouldn't spend more than you have. It's pretty simple then. By reducing expenditures, the government spends less, and by increasing taxes, it has more. In Sri Lanka's case, there were three key measures employed: an increase in taxes, removals of subsidies on fuel and electricity, and a cut on government spending across all departments by 6%. These measures, along with an increase in tourism and remittances after COVID-19 lockdowns were lifted, worked very well. The World Bank's most recent report on Sri Lanka's development reported consistent growth over 4 quarters, total inflation reduced from 70% down to single digits, and the currency appreciating by 11%. In 2023, they even had a surplus in their current account balance, which means that their foreign assets minus their foreign liabilities grew in the right direction, something that hasn't happened in Sri Lanka since 1977. But you already know now that the benefits of austerity measures aren't being felt across the board. As reforms have allowed for Sri Lanka to get closer to stability, the population has been facing worse and worse living conditions. The poverty rate has doubled from 2019 to 2023, even tripled in urban areas. A quarter of Sri Lankan families are food insecure, child malnutrition has risen while school attendance has gone down. Patients now expected to pay for their medicine are opting out of medicine altogether, and medical personnel are leaving the country in unprecedented numbers. 8% of Sri Lanka's doctors have left and 15% have requested long leave. Clearly, austerity measures are a double-edged sword at best. One of the reasons austerity measures can lead to this kind of discrepancy is because they hit the poor much harder than the rich. For example, one of Sri Lanka's austerity measures was a hike in value-added tax, a form of consumer tax that applies at every step of production where value is added to the product. As a quick example, imagine there's a car maker living in a country with a 10% VAT. When she buys the raw materials to make a car, let's say the raw materials cost $100. She pays $110 with the value-added tax, and the supplier of the materials pays that $10 to the government. Once the car maker's finished making the car, she sells it onto an auto centre for $200 plus the 20% tax. Because she already paid 10% tax on the raw materials, she can subtract it from the 20% on the sale, and she pays the government $10. Then the automaker sells the car for $300 and $330 after tax. He subtracts $20 tax that the car maker charged and also pays $10 to the government. So unlike something like an income tax, value-added tax will come out the same for every consumer, and Sri Lanka's increased the tax percentage to 18%, the highest it's been since 2006, and more than double what it was 3 years ago. For people in a higher wealth bracket, the increased tax can be an inconvenience, maybe even a cause for some serious penny pinching, but for people in the lowest wealth brackets that have to spend a large proportion of their income on food and other essentials, a tax hike can be devastating. And at the same time, the other side of austerity measures, decreased government spending, often means cutting expenditures that serve to support the same population being hit the hardest by increased consumption taxes. This happened when Sri Lanka removed their subsidies on fuel and electricity. The benefit for the economy is apparent, they're spending less money in the form of subsidies, but as a consequence, many of Sri Lanka's citizens lost their means of transportation, and in 2023, over 1 million households, approximately 1/6 of the population, lost connection to the grid because they couldn't afford the bills anymore. Sri Lanka also forced 2 major public pension funds to exchange their current bonds for new ones with reduced interest rates, or else pay twice the tax on the profits of their current bonds, and some analysts calculate that the consequent losses could be enormous for the Sri Lankan people. These obviously are not great outcomes, but outside of the human cost, they also call the long-term effectiveness of austerity measures into question. Social discontent like the kind found in Sri Lanka and political stability don't tend to go hand in hand. But political stability is crucial to maintaining any country's development, and civil tension naturally leads to political upheaval in many cases. And if that happens, foreign investors might deem Sri Lanka to be too risky a venture and raise interest rates on any lending. And in our last video on Sri Lanka, we explained how those higher interest rates got Sri Lanka into this mess in the first place. Already we can see the population's frustration can have enormous effects on the political landscape. In the most recent election, the first since 2022, Sri Lankan voters made history by electing their first third-party candidate, and the new president campaigned on a promise to renegotiate the IMF's bailout conditions. Long-term stability is also dependent on a strong labour market, especially for a country like Sri Lanka, which desperately needs to increase its exports. Before 2022, Sri Lanka actually had a lot going for it in terms of its labour market. Their literacy rate was notably high, and they had a lot of well-educated professionals. But with loss of transportation combined with poverty, combined with unemployment, Sri Lanka's current youth, the people who make up the next wave of the working population, are attending school at lower rates than before, which will affect those literacy and education rates. That's on top of a mass exodus of skilled workers who are dissatisfied with the tax hikes, the restructuring of their pension plans, and the rising rate of unemployment. So, even though austerity measures, as demonstrated by Sri Lanka, can help an economy in crisis, it will come at a hefty cost. And while the past can't be undone, are there better alternatives for future countries in crisis to be looking towards? Or is economic recovery at the cost of the population just inevitable? Probably the most famous example of a non-austerity approach was the US after the 2008 mortgage crisis. Instead of just slashing and taxing their way out, the government committed to a total of $475 billion to stabilise the financial system, with funds coming from the US Treasury, private investors, and loans from the Federal Reserve. Around $46 billion went into programs intended to help families avoid foreclosure, and around $80 billion went to stabilising the auto industry, and the government also created tax rebates for individuals and reduced tax burdens on businesses to encourage investment. In a way, the response was the opposite of austerity measures, increasing government spending and tax relief. And the US response had positive effects. These bailouts cost about $635 billion in the form of expenditures, loans and investments, but the Treasury made back about $744 billion. They actually made a profit off the bailouts. And in 2012, a survey conducted by the University of Chicago, leading economists generally agreed that bailouts helped to reduce unemployment. We can also look at Portugal for another non-austerity approach. Initially after the Great Recession, Portugal was in a very similar predicament to Sri Lanka. Faced with overwhelming debt, the government took a $116 billion loan, a third of which came from the IMF, on the agreement to implement a variety of austerity measures. They reduced pensions, froze wages, privatised utility companies, increased sales taxes, and cut unemployment benefits. Unlike Sri Lanka, these measures didn't prove fruitful for Portugal. So the government tried a different method. They introduced incentives in the form of subsidies, tax credits and funding for businesses, attracting major companies like Google and Mercedes-Benz to open up offices in Portugal and create new jobs. They also enticed foreigners by offering visas to those who invested large amounts in the country, and that program has amassed $5.3 billion in investments from 2012 to 2019. Of course, if you're in a large amount of debt, the basic principle of austerity, don't spend more than you have, is still worth paying attention to, but government budgets are not the same as personal budgets. Government spending can facilitate the same economic activity that will help fund that government spending. Cutting it out entirely would be like a failing business trying to save itself by not paying any staff to open the shop. It might save a little bit of money in the short term, but it's going to cause income problems as well. That being said, austerity can be an opportunity to look at irresponsible spending that can be cut out, especially if governments become bloated or corrupt, which can set them up for a better stimulus-led recovery once that fat has been trimmed. Sri Lanka's austerity measures have proved helpful for dealing with the immediate effects of a crisis, but the US and Portugal's approaches remind us that it's important to look beyond the immediate effects to begin stimulating future economies. And it's probably a good time for Sri Lanka to start considering its options for monetary inflows outside of taxes, especially through exports. Right now, Sri Lanka's export market is relatively narrow. Clothing and tea still dominate goods exports, and transportation and travel dominate services. And foreign investment focused on markets like construction has failed to increase Sri Lanka's ability to create exportable goods and services. But if Sri Lanka wants to do more than just recover and actually continue developing its economy, the export market could be vital. The World Bank report estimates that most of Sri Lanka's subsectors export less than they potentially could, and the untapped export potential is worth about $10 billion and 142,000 new jobs. Now, these are the economic challenges facing Sri Lanka, but they are not happening in a vacuum. We don't like to discuss politics here if we can avoid it, but a once-in-a-lifetime election, as well as global power plays between India and China, are all making this domestic economic crisis and recovery into something much bigger. You should be able to click to that video on your screen now. We also wanted to quickly mention that we have a huge announcement coming out next week for a project that we've been working on behind the scenes for almost 2 years now. So make sure to subscribe to keep up with that. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.